My Book House Through Fairy Halls. Hansel and Gretel. Adapted from the opera Hansel and Gretel by Humperdinck. Once upon a time, there lived in a little cottage on the edge of the Black Forest in Germany a broom maker named Peter and his wife Gertrude. They had 2 children, a boy, Hansel, and Gretel, a pretty little girl. Now Peter and Gertrude worked hard for a living, and Hansel and Gretel each had their tasks to perform to help provide for their daily needs. One fine summer's day, Gertrude said to the children, "Go out into the forest, my dears, and pick some strawberries, that our table may not be bare for supper." So Hansel took a basket from the wall, and Gretel took her brother by the hand, and off they went into the woods. The air was cool and pleasant, the little birds sang in the trees, and the children walked along over a carpet of thick, soft moss and sweet-smelling pine needles, while the sunshine trickled down through the leaves and made blotches of gold on their path. Further and further into the forest they wandered, picking strawberries and gathering flowers, of which they made garlands and nosegays. At last, Hansel cried joyously, "See our basket? It is full. We shall all have berries for supper." But just at that moment, the cry of a cuckoo sounded near at hand, echoing through the forest. "Cuckoo! Cuckoo!" cried Gretel, imitating the cry of the bird. "Cuckoo! Thou stealer of eggs!" "Cuckoo! Cuckoo!" answered Hansel, roguishly. "Cuckoo! Thou stealer of strawberries!" And he stole a strawberry out of the basket and sucked it into his mouth, as though he were a cuckoo sucking the egg he had found in another bird's nest. "Ho, ho!" cried Gretel. "I can do that too. Just watch me." And she took a berry also and sucked it into her mouth. Then the cuckoo in the forest cried again. "Cuckoo! Cuckoo!" mimicked Gretel. And Hansel laughed and cried as before, "Cuckoo! Cuckoo! Thou stealer of strawberries!" This time, however, he stole not one berry, but a whole handful to eat. And Gretel, not to be outdone, took just as many as he. So the children played the game of the cuckoo, turn and turn about, till they grew so excited over their play, they began to snatch the basket back and forth and quarrel over who should have it. Hansel was stronger than Gretel, and finally he jerked it out of her hands. A twinkling, he poured all the rest of the berries into his mouth and greedily swallowed them, every one. "What have you done? What have you done?" cried Gretel. Then she began to weep, for she saw what they had done. "We have eaten up all the berries, and there will be nothing at all for Mother and Father for supper," At that, Hansel also stood still and was sorrowful and repentant. "We must gather more," he said. But now as the children looked about, they saw that while they had been eating and quarreling, the sun had sunk in the west. Dull gold gleamed the sky through the pine trees. The songs of birds were hushed, and about them was dim gray twilight. "Nay, we cannot see to gather berries now," cried Grethel, and she crowded up close to her brother. Hansel squared his shoulders, threw up his head, and took his sister by the hand. "Come," he said, "I shall find the way out of the forest." On they wandered and on, but they could no longer see the path. The further they went, the deeper they lost themselves in the wood. And now all the light had faded out of the sky. It was dark, quite dark. Black loomed the giant pine trees about. Ghostly gleamed the little white birches. The woods were filled with strange night sounds. Over the marshes white mists arose, and hither and thither before them darted the gleaming fire of the will-o'-the-wisp. Still Hansel held his shoulders square and strode sturdily forward, holding his sister fast by the hand. But at last the two were both wearied out. Not another step could they plod. So they stopped in a little glade and said their evening prayer together. Then they laid themselves down on the moss and fell fast asleep with their arms twined about each other. By and by, a bird twittered in the trees. The sun came streaking through the leaves. It was morning. Grethel stretched herself and awoke. Wake up, Hansel," cried she. And when he, too, had opened his eyes, they set off once more through the forest. They had gone some little distance when, lo, they came straight upon a queer little house, and both stood in amazement. The cottage was all made of frosted cake. Its roof was of tarts and cookies, and its windows of transparent sugar. Around it stood a fence of life-sized gingerbread girls and boys. The children thought they had never seen anything look so inviting. "Ah," cried Hansel at once, "this will be something for us. We will have a good meal." And he ran forward and broke off a little piece of trimming from the house, while Grethel helped herself to a cookie shingle from the roof. Then there was heard a little voice from within the cottage. "Nibble, nibble, little mouse. Who nibbles at my little house?" But the children paid no heed. Hansel seized a whole frosting balcony, and Grethel wrenched off a tart. Then was heard again the little voice from within the cottage. Nibble, nibble, a little mouse. Who nibbles at my little house? Still, the children turned a deaf ear and went on cramming themselves. Now Hansel boldly broke off a great piece of the house itself, and Grethel pushed a whole round pane out of one of the windows. Then all at once the door opened, and out of the sugary-piggery cottage came an ugly old witch. Hansel and Grethel were so astonished that they dropped what they held to the ground. But their first alarm was soon lulled to rest, for the old woman said in a voice as sweet as honey, "Ah, my dear, sweet little children, who brought you here? Come in and stay with me. You shall come to no harm, and I will feed you full of sweet meats." She took them by the hand, and thinking only of what more they might find to eat within, they followed her into the house. A nice dinner she set before them, pancakes and sugar, syrup and honey. And soon Hansel and Grethel were so greedily stuffing themselves that they forgot entirely to be on their guard against the old witch. She called them by such pet names as Sugar Plum and Sugar Dolly, and said she loved such sweet little dears, loved them so much she could just eat them up. But Hansel and Grethel paid no heed. After dinner, she showed them 2 little white beds into which they crawled, and there they slept through the night. But early in the morning, before Hansel and Grethel were awake, the old witch got up, went over to a great oven in one corner of the house, and lit a blazing fire under it. Sweet little dears, they will be dainty morsels. They will make beautiful gingerbread children, she said, for this old syrup and honey witch lured children with sweetmeats to her sugar cottage. Then she popped them into the oven and turned them into gingerbread. When the fire was going, she seized Hansel right out of bed with one bony hand and carried him, wriggling and squirming, off to a cage that stood behind the house. Here, she locked him up and left him, though he shook the iron bars as hard as he could and shrieked to her boldly to let him loose. After that, she came back and rudely awakened Grethel. "Get up, little lazy bones," she cried. "Get up and set the table. Lay out on the cloth my little plate, and my little knife, and my little napkin, to wipe my mouth, and do it all quickly. I'm to have a delicious gingerbread boy for my breakfast." Now Grethel began to suspect that the witch was not as sweet as she seemed. She saw Hansel shut up in the cage and heard the noise he was making, and there she must lay out the little plate and wonder what was to be eaten on it, and lay out the little knife and wonder what was to be cut with it, and lay out the napkin and wonder. When the table was laid, the old witch called to Grethel, "Creep into the oven, little sweetie, and see if it is properly heated. If it is, then we'll put in our dough." She meant when Grethel had crawled in to bang the door shut and have a gingerbread girl as well as a boy for her breakfast. But by this time, Grethel guessed what the old woman intended. So she answered, "I don't know how to get into the oven." "Ah, my dear little sugar dolly," cried the witch. "Just crawl in. The opening is quite big enough. You can see. I could even do it myself." As she spoke, she hobbled up and poked her head into the opening. Quick as lightning, Grethel gave her a shove and sent her head first, sprawling into the oven. Then Grethel banged the door and bolted it, and ran off to the iron cage. In a twinkling, she had set Hansel free, and the two hurried out of the cottage. There, all about the house, they saw the row of gingerbread children turning pink and rosy, beginning to yawn and stretch themselves and move their arms and legs. They had all become real children again, set free from the old witch's charms when Grethel popped her into the oven. Joyously, they thronged around Hansel and Grethel as soon as they awoke. Then, all in a body, they went into the house to peep into the oven and see what had become of their enemy. There, lo and behold, was no witch at all, but just a huge ginger cake. But the children had no more desire to eat sweeties, you may believe. So they left the ginger cake and ran, laughing and singing, out into the forest. They had not gone far when Hansel and Grethel heard voices calling, and in another moment there came Peter and Gertrude out of the forest. The children ran and threw themselves into the arms of their father and mother. Long had Peter and Gertrude searched for their little ones, and now they held them close and covered them with kisses. Then they turned with glad cries and started off once more to lead all the children back to their homes. As they walked through the woods, Hansel and Grethel filled their baskets with strawberries, and when they returned to their humble cottage, they all shared the simple supper, and great was their rejoicing.